Hello, and welcome to Historicus Navalis, the History Channel specialized on the lives and fates of individual ships and seafarers, maritime myths and mysteries, and untold stories from the past. Today, we'd like to delve into the story of a Scottish-built steamship of the 19th century that truly deserves to be brought to light. We are talking about the sail steamer Andes, which later became the Spanish armed transport San Quintin. The ship played a quite unknown and marginal role in history. Nonetheless, she had plowed her way through an exciting career and ended up dishonorable and forgotten as a block ship when she was scuttled in April 1898 during the Spanish-American War. Her few remains are still existing and are considered the oldest iron shipwreck in the Philippines. Her life and fate have long been hidden in the shadows of history, and her story remained untold on to the present day. Some ambitious people from the scuba diving community tried their best to accumulate facts and figures about the ship. One even dared to say that there's no definite history, but they had not dug deep enough and therefore failed to reveal her amazing story. Now, through meticulous research work, it was possible to unravel the entire biography of this interesting ship. If you are a shiplover and crazy about maritime and naval history, this is something for you. So, please sit back, enjoy, and give us a like. It will encourage us to create more videos of underdocumented ships, their crews, and historical ventures. Thank you.
Built by William Denny and Britsh at Dumbarton in Scotland under yard number 34, the sail steamer Andes was launched on August 18, 1852, and, after being outfitted 3 months later, delivered to the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, formed by Samuel Cunard. The ship was a single-screw steamship with a riveted iron hull and sleek lines, a prominent weather deck camber, moderate sheer, 3 inclined masts, and a bark-type sail rig. The auxiliary sail rig was typical for steamships of that era, and it was only after 1870 when first steam warships slowly abandoned additional sails. The advent of compound and then triple expansion engines, water tube boilers, and twin-screw propulsion in the second half of the 19th century put an end to the need for auxiliary sails, even for transoceanic voyages. For propulsion, a common-geared beam engine of 300 horsepower, made by steam machinery specialists Tulloch and Denny, was installed. This type of engine, with two 66-inch cylinders and a 54-inch stroke, drove a screw propeller by means of a beam mechanism and gearing. The large gear wheel engaged with a pinion surrounding the propeller shaft. The first steam-powered ships used variants of the rotative beam engine. These marine steam engines, known as side lever, grasshopper, crosshead, walking beam, or just beam engines, all varied from the original land-based machines by having the beam in different positions to take up less room on board ship. And in fact, the height of the heavy walking beam posed a risk to the vessel as it raised the center of gravity and consequently reduced the intact stability of the ship, which compromised its seakeeping, especially in heavy weather. In order to overcome these physical constraints, the smart Scottish naval architects had the engine's 2 cylinders placed as low as possible in the ship's engine room.
For the necessary steam pressure, an Admiralty-type direct-tube fire tube boiler was installed, a boiler type that was extensively used on Scottish and British-built steamships before and in the early days of ironclads. On steam warships, the only protected place was below the waterline, sometimes under an armoured deck. So, to fit below short decks, the fire tubes were not led back above the furnace, but continued straight from it, with keeping the combustion chamber in between the 2 flues, hence the name direct tube boiler. This arrangement considerably reduced the diameter of the boiler and enabled it to be placed under deck with sufficient overhead clearance for periodical maintenance and repairs. The boilers delivered a steam pressure of 6 pounds per square inch, or 0.4 bar, and the average coal consumption was less than 5 pounds, or 2.3 kilograms, per indicated horsepower per hour.
In addition, pig iron ingots, also known as kentlage, or lingots in Spanish, were stuffed between the bottom frames and the lower holds to serve as ballast for good stability even without cargo on board. By these arrangements, the vessel's GM, or metacentric height, was satisfactory under all loading conditions, and during her sea trials, the ship proved an excellent seakeeping in rough weather. Already on her maiden voyage, this was put to the test in a violent storm. It should be noted that primary dimensions and other particulars of steamships built in a series in the mid-19th century were not 100% identical. In those days, a drafting technique called lofting was used for designing and construction of ships. Lofting was done on a large floor in one of the shipyard buildings, where curved lines were generated to be used then in plans for streamlined ship hull forms. These lines were drawn on planks, which were cut for further wood crafting. Over centuries, this hands-on technique was constantly improved, and it was not before 1970 when it was gradually replaced by mathematical tables and later by computer-aided design software for ship construction.
However, Scottish-built iron hull sail steamers delivered between 1852 and 1878 had very similar shapes, which made it quite difficult to distinguish individual vessels. These ships slightly differed only in main dimensions and sail rigs. Therefore, it can be said that William Denny and Brothers built at least 3 sister ships of the SS Andes. The first was the SS Australian, that featured the same 3-masted sail rig and beam engine. She was launched in March 1852. The second was the SS Sydney, launched in May 1852, again with the same rig, but it had a less powerful engine installed. Both ships were delivered to the Australian Royal Mail Steam Navigation Company. They were a bit larger in terms of gross tonnage due to higher coal bunkering capacities required for the long voyage to and from Australia. But they had a shorter length between perpendiculars, LPP, an aspect that made the Andes, with her maximum speed of 11 knots faster than her preceding siblings. And finally, there was the SS Alps, literally, an almost perfect copy of the SS Andes, launched in September 1852, and delivered to the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company as well. The SS Andes and her siblings were designed primarily to carry mail, but also had accommodations for 180 to 200 passengers. The Andes had comfortable first-class cabins for 62 passengers, and there was space in the ship's tween deck for about 120 so-called steerage passengers.
Registered on November 11, 1852 in Glasgow, the Andes was Cunard's first purpose-built screw steamer with an iron hull. On December 8, 1852, she embarked on her maiden voyage from Liverpool to New York. About 80 nautical miles south of Cape Clear, Ireland, she encountered heavy weather. She lost her jib boom, stanchions, and had her forward bulwark dented, so the captain sailed her back to Liverpool for damage repair. Before the turn of the year, repairs were accomplished, and she made a successful voyage to New York, Jamaica, Chagres, and back.
In the following months of 1853, the steamer was deployed on the New York-Chagres route. Chagres was once the main Atlantic port of Panama, situated at the historical site of Fort San Lorenzo. During the California Gold Rush, it was a bustling seaport and disembarkation hub for gold miners who used to travel overland the Isthmus of Panama to the Pacific side. Today, it is an abandoned village and a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
In June 1853, the Andes, together with her sister Alps, was subjected to some modifications, apparently of the steam propulsion plant. The works were carried out in Greenock, Scotland, by steam machinery specialists McNab and Clark, which in 1863 became McNab and Company. However, British contemporary records found during our research do not specify whether the engine was replaced by a more powerful one, but it can be assumed that the direct tube boiler was removed and a more effective marine boiler of the Lancashire return tube boiler type with 2 parallel flues was installed. In late summer 1853, the Andes was put back in service, but seamanship skills of her crew were again challenged during the forthcoming transatlantic voyage. On September 10, 1853, on her outward passage to New York, Approximately 150 nautical miles west of Ireland, she was overrun by a revolving storm. Although her master, Captain Hutchings, was prudent to slow down engine speed right in time and heave the ship to, they were hit by a rogue wave that washed overboard the second mate, Mr. Maxwell, and seriously injured the captain himself. Despite the best medical care given by the ship's surgeon, Captain Hutchings passed away 1 week later, while the ship was still en route to her destination. He was buried with all honors at sea, and the chief mate, Mr. Moody, took over command of the vessel.
On 18th October 1853, the Liverpool Mercury published Mr. Moody's report to the company's fleet director, which reads as follows. The ship during the heavy weather we experienced was the admiration of all on board, that unfortunate sea being the only heavy water on her deck. The hurricane lasted 12 hours, commencing from south-southeast and moderating at north-northwest, then backed to the southwest quarter, from which we experienced very heavy gales up to the 15th of September, 3 days of which we were lying to. I am, dear sir, your obedient servant, Edwin R. Moody, Chief Officer of the steamship Andes Boston, 23rd September 1853. In April 1854, the British government chartered the Andes and sent it as a troop ship to the Black Sea during the Crimean War. On her first voyage, carrying 1,000 British infantry troops on board, she sailed into a storm east of Gibraltar, causing her to roll violently in the heavy seas. During the night, a fire broke out in her boiler room, which was supposed to have originated in consequence of too great draught of the furnaces. As the situation was not brought immediately under control, the captain ordered to jettison 50,000 rounds of rifle cartridges in order to save the ship and lives on board. Eventually, before dawn, the fire was extinguished, and the ship continued to proceed to Malta, where it safely arrived 2 days later. In a newspaper article published soon after the incident, it was claimed that the ship had been outfitted with only 2 lifeboats, which, if it were true, could have triggered an official investigation. But during a sitting in the House of Lords on May 12, 1854, the allegation was found inaccurate.
Once the SS Andes had arrived in the Black Sea, she was reassigned as a hospital ship and got modified accordingly. Beginning with the arrival of British and French troops in Turkey and Bulgaria during the spring and early summer of 1854, the Allied expeditionary forces were hit hard by a series of epidemical waves that decimated their troops more than the actual fighting which ensued later. In the 2 years of the war, thousands of soldiers and sailors died from cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery, and the medical staff and crew on board the Andes labored day and night to save lives as best as they could. Since June 1854, the relative inactivity and lack of rigid sanitary precautions in the military camps at Varna, Bulgaria, led to an eruption of cholera that affected a large part of the troops. In September 1854, eventually, embarkation of the Allied landing forces on board of primary warships commenced, which took several days. On September 14th, the Andes was part of the Allied fleet which landed British, French, Sardinian, and Ottoman army divisions on the west coast of the Crimea Peninsula, intending to capture the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. On November 5, 1854, the Russians broke out of the besieged city of Sevastopol and launched an attack towards the Inkerman Ridge. The British battalions were taken by surprise and suffered heavy casualties. During the Battle of Inkerman, the commanding officer of the 21st Fusiliers Regiment from Cork, Ireland, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Ainsley, was mortally wounded and brought by an ambulance wagon to the port of Balaclava. There he was hoisted on board of the Andes and handed over to the care of her medical staff. The ship then set sail, and with a full load of wounded and sick soldiers, she headed for Scutari, the today's Üsküdar district of Istanbul, Turkey. However, upon reaching her destination on 14th of November, sadly, Lieutenant Colonel Ainsley died on board and was buried there at the English ground of the Hayder Pasha Cemetery.
That was even more tragic as Florence Nightingale and her nursing party had already arrived at Scutari on November 4th. By this time, Nightingale was already well known to the British public and had been depicted in the press as the Lady with the Lamp. During October 1854, reports in the Times sent by William Howard Russell had described the poor care for the wounded and the lack of nurses. This led Sidney Herbert, Secretary of State for War, to ask Nightingale to lead a team of 38 nurses to Scutari, where they did a formidable job along with the British Sanitary Commission. Thousands of wounded soldiers owed their lives to her and her groundbreaking reforms of military and public health care.
After the Russian campaign had come to an end, that was in February 1856, the charter contract with the British government was not extended, and so the SS Andes was returned to the Cunard Line. Soon after she was sold and came under ownership of the British and Foreign Steam Navigation Company. However, her career under the British flag was soon to come to an end. Meanwhile, the Royal Spanish Navy had entered a period of consolidation and strengthening. At the beginning of 1859, the Royal Spanish Navy had only 9 transports, all of which were pure sailing vessels with loading capacities ranging from 150 to 1,000 tons. The overall transport capacity of these ships was merely about 5,500 tons, not enough to cover the needs of the military presence in the Asian, African, and Caribbean colonies. Additionally, the Ministry of War and Overseas Operations had chartered merchant steamers to secure regular mail service with the colonies. It goes without saying that in view of the long distances and overseas commitments of the Spanish government, the means to maintain control over the scattered colonial possessions that required projection of naval forces were quite limited.
In 1859, the paddle steamers Velasco, ex-Hibernia, of 960 gross tons, and Marque de Regla, ex-Caledonia, both of which had been acquired from the Cunard Line in 1850, were already decommissioned and in the process of being auctioned. Now, to cover the urgent need for increased transport capacities, these ships were recovered and recommissioned. On top of that, the Navy established a commission led by naval engineer Trinidad Garcia de Quesada, who assigned the Navy commander Miguel Lobo Malagamba to act as representative in England and study the acquisition of additional ships suitable for naval transports. As a result of these efforts, in May 1859, an agreement was reached for the acquisition of 9 steamships. On July 2, 1859, the Ministry of War and Overseas Operations purchased the Luna, renamed her Malaspina, and the Duke of Rothesay, and renamed her Seat. They were soon sent to the Philippines and the Caribbean. The other 7 steamers were the Alps, renamed San Francisco de Borja, and the Andes, which was renamed San Quintin, both of nearly 1,300 gross tons. The Lebanon, now renamed General Alava, of 1,500 gross tons. The Tenerife, renamed Patiño, and the Taurus, renamed Marqués de la Victoria, both of 1,200 gross tons. The last vessels to join the newly purchased fleet of transports were the Ferrol, of 800 gross tons, and the Glasgow, renamed San Antonio, of 600 gross tons.
The overall transport capacity of these ships, including the 2 recovered paddle steamers, now aggregated to approximately 15,000 tons, ergo 3 times the capacity the Navy had available at the beginning of the year. It should be noted that the sources of all these facts and figures do not indicate whether the said transport capacity was given in gross tons or deadweight tonnage, which are not the same. Broadly speaking, the term tonnage measures a ship's size expressed either by volume or weight. Gross tonnage is a measurement of a ship's overall volume given in cubic meters. Thus, it applies to the ship herself, not to her cargo. Deadweight tonnage, on the other hand, is a measurement of a ship's cargo carrying capacity, whereby it includes the total weight of cargoes loaded, equipment, ballast water, fuel and fresh water, provisions, passengers, and crew. The dead weight does not include the light weight of the ship, which is the term for the weight of the empty or naked ship. The decline, if not to say the demise, of the Spanish Empire is one prime example of a broad historical pattern first elaborately described by Paul Kennedy in his great work, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, published in 1987. 2 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union, which marked the end of the Cold War, the eminent Yale historian showed in detail how great powers always struggled to balance wealth and their economic base with their military strength and strategic objectives. Kennedy argued every nation that gains great power will arrive sooner or later at a point where it comes under persistent tensions between the imperatives to save and invest, the need for defense efforts, and the inevitable consumption of resources. At the time of its maximum imperial expansion, Spain was certainly the wealthiest nation at all, but beginning with the secession of the Low Countries in 1579 and following the defeat of its armada in 1588, Spain fell behind the Dutch Republic and Italy in terms of per capita income. Spain's decline, however, has its roots in the early 17th century, and its backwardness deepened in the first half of the 19th century.
The loss of its South American empire meant a deep cut of revenues, and the economic crisis that went with it had major political repercussions and civil uprisings against the reign of the king. Ferdinand VII eventually sidelined his brothers, and what was dubbed the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830 enabled his daughter Isabella to become queen. But under the reign of Isabella II, security and calm did not return to the country, and political unrest became a commonplace. In 1868, the so-called Glorious Revolution eventually saw the generals Francisco Serrano and Juan Prim revolting against Isabella and defeated her army at the Battle of Alcolea, leading to her being deposed and exiled to Paris. However, during Isabella's reign, military expenditures had been greatly increased, particularly to the benefit of the Royal Spanish Navy, and Spain rose to number 4 of the world's largest naval powers. For some time after Isabella's forced resignation, names of Spanish Navy ships were still generally prefixed NSB, standing for Nuestra Señora Buque in English, Our Lady's Ship. However, the last convulsions of the Spanish Empire in the second half of the 19th century greatly affected its military strength, and soon found resonance in the slow but steady decline of its navy after 1880. By 1860, the Spanish fleet was composed mainly of converted but obsolete ships of the line and slow paddle steamers with auxiliary sail rigs. Moreover, in view of the uncountable commitments in overseas waters, the persistent lack of transport capacities posed a great challenge for the Navy. Following its final defeat in the Spanish South American Wars of Independence in 1833, Spain only retained the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico, which it ultimately lost after the Spanish-American War of 1898. Notwithstanding, the government in Madrid desperately clung to its last outposts in the Caribbean, North Africa, and the Western Pacific, and often used coercive power to maintain control of them. In times of political turmoils and continuous abatement of naval strength, such out-of-area operations overstretched the government's financial budget and put additional strain on the fleet and its manpower.
So, it was obvious that lots of important tasks and challenges were waiting for the newly acquired transport, San Quintin, ex-SS Andes. Soon after commissioning, the ship was dispatched on a voyage to Cuba in the Philippines and returned to Spain before the end of the year. On that long haul, the engine was used as much as possible and proved quite reliable. The experience made with the deep furnaces of the boilers in her early years were taken into account, and steam pressure was reduced whenever the ship went into heavy weather. Shortly after her return to Spain, she was ordered to load military supplies for the Spanish Expedition Corps that had been deployed to North Africa during the Spanish-Moroccan War. The war, which lasted 4 months, began in December 1859, when a Spanish landing force at Ceuta began the invasion of the Sultanate of Morocco. The objective was to take Tetuan, a stronghold which had served in the past for Moroccan raids on Ceuta and Melilla. Admiral Herrera, who was in command of the Spanish naval squadron, had been ordered to arrange for transport of troops and sufficient supply of ammunition and provisions for the fighting Army Corps. By means of his newly acquired transport vessels in November 1859, he and his sailors managed to safely move 35,000 troops, 2,950 horses, the associated artillery, provisions, and medical equipment to Ceuta. At the end of March 1860, the Spanish Expeditionary Corps in Morocco had been increased to more than 45,000 soldiers. In hindsight, it seemed that the Navy was organized and directed by much better brass and brains in the Continental Army. As it quickly turned out, the three Army Corps, headed by arrogant and incompetent generals, were ill-prepared, poorly equipped, and with an egregious lack of overland transport material, which explains the death toll of nearly 4,000 Spanish soldiers, two-thirds of whom did not die on the battlefield, but were rather victims of cholera and other diseases. Even after ceasefire in March 1860, the San Quintin was involved in a number of supply operations between Spain and North Africa.
After the first major public demonstration of Queen Isabella's navy at Alicante in May 1858, another naval review was carried out in September 1860. On that occasion, the San Quintin was ordered to join the squadron. Taking the lead, the screw frigate Princesa de Asturias had the royal family and its entourage embarked on board. Following their flagship in the wake, the ship of the line Rey Don Francisco de Assis, the sail corvette Mazaredo, the paddle steamers General Liniers, Lepanto and Isabel II, and the transports San Francisco de Borja and General Alava, also the San Quintin, proudly showed her colors. And despite all political turmoils, it was a solemn occasion and a moment when memories of the past and the glory of the once mighty Armada arose again. In early 1861, the Dominican General Pedro Santana requested Queen Isabella II of Spain to retake control of the Dominican Republic after a period of 17 years of Dominican sovereignty. In response, Spanish troops poured into Santo Domingo to support Spanish bureaucrats and priests who displaced Dominicans as civil and religious servants. Within 3 months, 6,000 Spanish troops occupied the island. Soon the number swelled to 30,000 soldiers supported by 22 warships. These were supplemented by battalions of Cuban and Puerto Rican volunteers. The San Quintin was assigned to take part in these operations. When the conflict took on greater proportions, it was necessary to maintain floating hospitals in the area. For this role, the San Quintin and the merchant steamer Catalunya were chosen. Both vessels arrived at Santo Domingo in summer of 1861. The year 1861 also marked the outbreak of the American Civil War. Again, the Spanish Navy took maximum advantage of the San Quintin and got her chartered as a blockade runner by the Confederate government. In that role, the ship commuted several times between seaports of the southern states and Cuba, carrying contraband goods for the Confederate forces. The Union blockade was based on the so-called Anaconda Plan, a strategic proposal introduced by the Union Army General Winfield Scott in the early stage of the Civil War. It called for a naval blockade of the Confederate States coastline, cutting off vital military and civilian supplies to the southern belligerent and helping the Union to eventually win the war. However, it is agreed that the blockade was never that effective. Throughout the war, more than 75% of all Confederate ventures to evade the blockade were crowned with success. The main reason was certainly that the blockade runners, including many privateers, were relatively small ships with sleek design and powerful propulsion, which gave them speed and a leg up on the Union vessels involved in the blockade.
Many of the blockade runners were built in British shipyards and sold to British or Southern owners. Nearly all of them were privately owned, though the Confederate government purchased some, commissioning them into the Confederate Navy. They also purchased commerce raiders built in Britain to prey on Union shipping. The United States Navy faced the enormous task of patrolling over 3,500 miles of coastline, while simultaneously patrolling the waters of the British Caribbean possessions and the approaches to Great Britain itself. The first ship to evade the Union blockade was the SS A and B, a bark from Belfast, making its way from Charleston Harbor. It turned out that Scottish-built steamers, especially from the Clydebank, were particularly suitable for the dangerous task of blockade running, and many were sold to Confederate agents.
Whereas the San Quintin was, with her 72 metres length overall, actually not a small vessel, but her 300 horsepower steam engine made her fast, and therefore a well-suited blockade runner that accomplished a number of successful runs to ports of the American southern states and back to Cuba.
In January 1861, Republican liberals had captured Mexico City, and shortly thereafter, the newly installed liberal government dismissed the Spanish ambassador to Mexico, prompting Spain to send an army corps to protect Spanish interests. At the same time, the French Emperor Napoleon III thought to take advantage of Mexico's political instability and tried to establish a French client state. He installed Maximilian of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, as Emperor of Mexico, a move that met strong resistance from the Mexican liberals. To enforce the enthronement of the Muppet Emperor and the collection of debts from the Mexican government, a French army corps landed at Veracruz. In support of the French military intervention, Spain had an interest in overthrowing the Mexican liberal government and to reinstate some political influence it lost after the Mexican War of Independence in 1821. On December 8, 1861, a Spanish naval force carrying 6,000 Spanish troops, led by General Prim, anchored at Veracruz, which had been occupied earlier by troops of Spain's allies, Britain and France. The Mexican campaign, however, turned out to become another debacle for the Spanish government, in which they wasted again their human resources. In February 1862, the San Quintin was dispatched to Veracruz to take on board 200 Spanish soldiers suffering from cholera and yellow fever and carry them to Havana, Cuba, for medical treatment. Once her highly infectious cargo had been disembarked, the ship loaded provisions and forage and maize for horses and cattle for the Spanish Expedition Corps in Mexico and sailed back to Veracruz. Meanwhile, in May 1865, the American Civil War had come to an end. A few months later, the San Quintin was dispatched to the South American West Coast, where tensions had been rising between Spain and Peru. In the early 1860s, Spain had occupied the Chincha Islands, which belonged to Peru, and by virtue of their enormous deposits of guano, constituted the mainstay of Peru's economy. Requested for support, Chile responded by prohibiting Chilean nationals selling the Spanish fleet coal and other vital supplies, and by joining an inter-American conference to stop Spanish aggression. Madrid turned on Chile for placing an embargo on Spanish ships. As compensation for the insult, Spain demanded that Chile pay a large indemnity as well as fire a 21-gun salute to the Spanish flag. When Chile refused, Spanish Admiral Juan Manuel Pareja established a naval blockade of Valparaiso and other ports. Consequently, on September 24, 1865, the government in Santiago de Chile declared war on Spain.
The Chincha Islands War began with a number of skirmishes between Spanish and Chilean ships. In view of the Spanish superiority, the Chilean Navy first tried to avoid engaging the main force of the Spanish squadron. But on November 26, 1865, during the naval battle of Papudo, the Spanish steam-powered schooner, Spanish da Goleta, named Virgen de Covadonga, which served as an aviso in the Spanish squadron, was forced to surrender to the Chilean corvette Esmeralda and was captured. Once the Spanish admiral Juan Manuel Pareja got informed about her loss, he committed suicide. On December 4, 1865, the Aviso was commissioned by the Chilean Navy, rearmed and henceforth classified as gunboat. On Christmas Day 1865, the Covadonga sailed from Abtao to the Magellan Strait with the purpose of intercepting the San Quintin. The Spanish transport was supposed to relieve the steamer Marqués de la Victoria, or otherwise bring war supplies to the Spanish fleet blocking the port of Valparaiso. The Covadonga took the most frequently used route towards the Magellan Strait and met several foreign vessels on her way. On January 7, 1866, she called Punta Arenas, where information from the governor were received that no Spanish ship had crossed the straits after the armed transport Marqués de la Victoria. Also, the commander of a Russian gunboat anchored in Punta Arenas advised that he had not seen any Spanish ship at port since his boat had passed Montevideo on its way to the south. Luckily, the San Quintin managed to bypass the Covadonga, although she was not inferior to the Chilean gunboat, and could have brought to bear a significant shell fire with her two 4.7-inch quick-firing guns.
In the essence, the conflict was a naval contest. Soon, the superior Spanish squadron gained control of Chile's coast all along from Arica down to Coronel. However, Chilean gunboats inflicted some damage and minor losses, prompting the Spanish fleet to warn its adversary that unless they paid for damages and fired a 21-gun salute, its ships would open fire on the city of Valparaiso. U.S. and British warships cruising in the area did not interfere and remained neutral. Valparaiso, which had only a few coastal fortifications not worth mentioning, was virtually defenseless. On March 31, 1866, the Spanish squadron lined up before the port and commenced bombarding the city, main parts of which were reduced to rubble. It was not before mid-April when the Spanish ships left the area and sailed for Callao. There, the Spanish Ego experienced a heavy punch when their ships came too close to the shore and within range of the big guns of Peruvian coastal batteries, which wreaked havoc among them. Arriving at that point, Madrid got fed up with the unproductive war and eventually ordered the fleet to return home. The war for the Chincha Islands was over, but the Royal Spanish Navy was involved without any glory. No official resolution was reached between Chile and Spain until 1879. Chile's naval defeat convinced the government in Santiago to build up a powerful navy and modernize existing ships. As it demonstrated during the Saltpeter War, also known as War of the Pacific, which lasted from 1879 to 1884, Chile's fleet had the strength to defeat Bolivia and Peru, an eyebrow-raising achievement that came up unexpectedly for most of the world's naval powers. Spain wormed its way out of this unpopular war empty-handed, and a mutiny at Cadiz in 1868 eventually put an end to Isabella's long and despotic rule. What followed was a period of political unrest. The turmoil soon erupted into open civil war between three factions, during which Cartagena was seized by radical Republicans.
But let's turn back to the San Quintin. After 9 years of continued busy services across the Atlantic and Pacific, the strain on the ship's hull structure and lack of maintenance had left their mark. In 1868, it was time for the long overdue dry docking, and thus the San Quintin was sent to the Navy arsenal at Cartagena, where she was thoroughly overhauled and refitted. In the second half of the year 1868, dark clouds appeared over the horizon in the Caribbean, and tensions in Cuba were growing. Led by sugar planter Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, the Cuban Revolution began. Céspedes proclaimed independence and formed the Republic of Cuba on October 10, 1868. By the following year, Céspedes had written a constitution that abolished slavery and annexed the country to the United States of America. Within the long list of actions and naval expeditions carried out by the Cuban insurgents, it is worth highlighting at least one that had an impact upon the course of the war. On the night of March 23, 1869, the Spanish merchant steamer Comanditario of the Cuban General Navigation Company, which provided regular cabotage service 2 days a week between the ports of Havana and Cardenas, was assaulted and captured by a group of 27 armed insurgents. These, led by Angel Loño, had already boarded the ship in Havana as disguised passengers. The captain, the rest of the crew, and 78 passengers, 6 of them women, had been locked in their cabins and, in the next morning, were marooned on Palanqueta Cay in the Bahamas with a lean amount of water and provisions. The intention of the insurgents was to convert the steamer on the British island of San Tomas and make it the first warship of the Cuban armed forces. Renamed Yara, it was used as a privateer against the Royal Spanish Navy. However, the adventure of the newborn Yara would barely last 8 days. On March 31st, after several days travelling under sails between Cuba and the Bahamas, the Yara was sighted by other merchantmen and reported to the Spanish authorities in Cuba. The Naval Command in Havana immediately ordered a search operation to intercept the privateer. The mission was entrusted to the gunboats Luisa and Union, and the fastest ship available at the station, the transport San Quintin with her powerful engine, and Lieutenant First Class Faustino Barreda Perez in command. The ship sailed in company of the armed merchant steamer Marcela and the cargo ship Dihigo, which were provided by the mail shipping company and the owner of the captured ship.
After several hours of searching, in the morning of March 31, 1869, Lieutenant Perez eventually sighted the Yara in the northern channel of New Providence and surprised her while her crew was busy with coaling operations. When the Spanish ships appeared, about 14 tons of coal had already been taken into the ship's bunker hold. The Cuban commander hastened to weigh anchor and tried to escape towards the coast of Nassau. The Spanish ships immediately engaged the privateer, and after a brief chase down the channel, the San Quintin managed to outrun and stop the fugitive. The privateer was finally captured by the Luisa, commanded by Lieutenant Pardo de Figueroa, because the gunboat's shallow draft allowed it to safely approach the coast. Upon boarding the Yara, 6 of its former crew members were found, who had been forced by the insurgents to remain on board after their capture. 6 of the insurgents drowned while trying to reach the shore by boat or swimming. The rest, about 15 men, succeeded to escape. The vessel's open steam valves were quickly shut off, and seawater in the holds and engine room was pumped overboard. It was further noted that a number of fake cannons, made of wood and blanket wrapping, had been mounted on deck. Shortly after the capture, the British gunboat Cherub arrived on the scene. Its commander came upon Lieutenant Figueroa on board the Luisa and demanded the surrender of the Spanish force for reasons of having entered waters of British jurisdictional authority. He advised the Spanish commander that he did not have permission to disembark armed troops and pursue the escapees by land. Figueroa refused to do so and argued that the captured ship was a Spanish steamer and its crew also Spanish, respectively Cuban nationals. To ease the tensions, Figueroa then agreed to navigate the captured vessel 30 miles out to sea. There it would be picked up by the San Quintin, which had to put it in tow and bring it ultimately to Havana. That was done accordingly, and on the next day, April 6, 1869, at 6 a.m. in the morning, tug and tow entered the port of Havana. The gunboat Luisa remained in the area for another several hours looking out for the escapees, who finally managed to reach Nassau in the following days. The main ringleaders involved in the capture of the steamer Comanditario were tried in absentia by a naval court in Havana and sentenced to death, which meant that the moment they fell into the hands of the Spanish, they could be executed without a new trial, as it then happened 2 years later with one of them.
The following 12 years were filled with busy routine tasks performed by the San Quintin. But sometime between 1880 and 1882, the ship must have had another major overhauling at the Arsenal of Cartagena or elsewhere. Unfortunately, during our research, no records were found which mention or describe any dry docking or engine repairs. However, it is quite obvious that the ship's entire propulsion plant was replaced by a more powerful steam engine. A clear indication of this conjecture is the official list of warships and transports of the Spanish Navy, published by the Ministry of the Navy in 1884. The document has an entry of the San Quintin that shows the ship fitted with an engine of 1,500 horsepowers, which are 5 times the output of the original engine installed by Tulloch and Denny when she was built in Scotland 32 years ago. It may be assumed with good reason that the old-fashioned beam engine had been replaced by a reciprocal compound engine, which would explain the considerable power boost. Apparently, the original low-pressure boilers had been replaced as well. A compound engine required higher steam pressure, which made it necessary to install high-performance boilers, like the Scotch Marine boiler. Upon diving on the wreck today, it can be seen that the ship had 2 large horizontal fire tube boilers. That type of steam boiler had 1 or more cylindrical furnaces in the lower part of the boiler shell. Above this were a number of small diameter fire tubes. This setup allowed for maximum heating surface area and greatly increased the boiler's efficiency. In 1882, the San Quintin was detached to the Philippines, together with the new cruiser Aragon. Both ships reinforced the Spanish colonial task force in their operations conducted near Rio Grande de Mindanao, along with the schooners Sirena and Valiente, and the gunboats Samar, Paragua, Bulusan, Pampanga, and Panay.
In 1885, the need for further transport capacities for war material and supplies in the Philippine Islands forced the Spanish government to authorize the purchase of a ship that met its requirements and provided proper seaworthiness. The Navy Commission reached an agreement with the owners of a suitable ship for purchase. This ship had been built in 1866 by the British shipyard J&G Thompson in Glasgow. Originally laid down as the SS Sumatra, the ship was renamed Siberia and launched on July 2, 1867. She was part of a general steamship project of the Cunard Line, and on September 24, 1867, the vessel embarked on her maiden voyage from Liverpool to Quebec via Queenstown, Ireland. On March 21, 1871, the SS Siberia commenced direct sailings on the Liverpool, Queenstown, Boston route, of which her last voyage was on September 5, 1878. She was then sold to Spanish owners in 1880 and renamed Manila. For its defense and operations against land bases, 2 4.7-inch rifled bronze cannons were mounted on deck, same as had been installed on the San Quintin. These Hontoria-type breech-loading guns soon had to be used in defense of Spanish rights over the Pacific territories. However, it cannot be said with certainty which of the 2 models of that gun was installed, either the proven Model 79 or the new Model 83. The latter of which had a slightly higher firing rate.
A few months after her registration on the official list of Navy ships, the war transport Manila took part in one of the last colonial conflicts in which Spain was involved in the 19th century. It was the Spanish-German question of the Carolinas that made it to the headlines in August 1885. The Spanish government wanted to ensure its sovereignty over these islands, where many Methodist preachers with anti-Spanish resentments had been settled for years. On August 1, 1885, the Manila was given marching orders to depart for the Caroline Islands. The ship had to take on board a military detachment, office supplies, public works equipment, and the administration personnel necessary to establish a governance in the islands. However, the Spanish Naval Command quickly realized that the vessel's cargo capacity was by far insufficient for that operation, and in view of this, they commissioned also the armed transport San Quintin and the auxiliary freight ship Carriedo for carrying convict laborers and soldiers, as well as materials for building a church and the governor's residence. A few days later, the Manila moved to Zamboanga in Mindanao, where she remained until August 16th, the day she set sail to Puerto Tomil on Yap Island in the Western Carolinas. The voyage, however, was overshadowed by the loss of one sailor who fell overboard on August 18th and could not be rescued despite an extended search conducted in assistance of the Carriedo. Meanwhile, the San Quintin continued her voyage alone towards the destination, where she arrived at 4 p.m. on August 21st. While probing the bottom of Yap Bay for a suitable anchor holding ground, the ship lost one of her anchors. The next day, on August 22nd, the Manila and the Carriedo eventually arrived around noon and dropped their anchors nearby.
It was known that Germany was about to claim sovereignty over the Western Carolinas. Hence, the appointed Spanish governor of the islands, Don Enrique Capriles, and his staff began negotiations with local officials the following day by declaring Spanish sovereignty over the islands. However, 3 days were squandered in minor formalities, and the flag-hoisting ceremony was postponed because the governor-to-be did not like the place chosen for his administration building. Then, to everyone's surprise, the SMS Iltis, an Imperial German gunboat, appeared in the bay on August 25th. Without wasting time, the Germans dispatched a landing party ashore and raised the Imperial flag prior to the act planned by the Spanish, thereby giving rise to a diplomatic conflict between Spain and Germany. The commanding officer of the German warship, Commander Hofmeier, went on board the San Quintin to meet with First Lieutenant Luis Bayo, Hernandez Pinzon, and the captain of the San Quintin, Commander Guillermo España. The German officer declared that possession of the islands had been taken in the name of the Emperor of Germany, William II. Neither Don Capriles, the appointed governor, nor the captains of the Spanish ships made any attempt to resist. After consultation with Capriles, the Spanish commanders received orders to withdraw from the Carolinas and return to the Philippines. Upon their arrival in Manila, Capriles and the captains of the two ships were rewarded for their diplomatic skills. Capriles was even appointed to the government of Mindoro Island. The incident provoked an alarming report that was circulated in Manila, claiming that the Germans allegedly prepare for an attack upon the Philippines. The walls of Intramuros in Manila were fortified, guns installed, and the cry of invasion resounded all over the Philippines. Hundreds of families fled from the capital and adjacent provinces in panic, and for a time, German residents were even harassed by some activists.
The situation of the Spanish authority in the Carolinas had already become uneasy, and things continued to be complicated in Ponape until September 1887. Ponape is an island of the Señavin Islands, which are part of the larger Caroline Islands group. A Spanish flotilla formed by the General Lezo, the San Quintin, the Cebu, and the Manila regained control of the coast and the area around Santiago de la Ascensión, which was the capital city of Ponape during Spanish rule. Upon entering Ponape Harbor on November 21st, the San Quintin dropped anchor near the American cruiser USS Essex, and mutual visits were exchanged. Over the next few days, also officers of the gunboat Cebu visited the Essex, and personal contacts and friendly exchange of experiences were cultivated. When also the American mission ship Morning Star arrived, the small harbor became crowded. In 1887, the Spanish Navy had following ships deployed in the Philippines: the cruisers Aragon and Velasco, the Aviso Marqués del Duero, the light cruisers General Leso, Elcano, and Filipinas, the schooners, or goletas, Sirena and Valiente, the armed transports Manila, Cebu, and San Quintin, as well as 13 gunboats. The Hydrographic Commission was embarked on the steamship Argos. The years of demanding and exhaustive services performed by the San Quintin and the Manila on their frequent voyages between the Philippines and the Carolinas, and above all, the continued supply of material and livestock to the isolated garrisons took its toll on the ships and greatly affected the wear and tear of their engines. Far from the Carolinas, where the situation seemed to have settled since 1890, both ships were used for logistics support of the Spanish forces, which were then beginning to fight the Philippine independence insurgency.
On top of that, Mindanao, the second largest island of the Philippine archipelago, became the theater of a resumed guerrilla war in 1890, what was known as the so-called Moro conflict, or in Spanish, La Guerra Español y Moro. That conflict was a series of battles in the Philippines, lasting several centuries since the arrival of the Spaniards 370 years ago. Starting in April 1891, the San Quintin and the transport Manila were parts of General Valeriano Weyler's campaign in Mindanao. Weyler, in his authority as Governor-General of the Philippines, had ordered a series of military operations to secure the links between the fortified posts and establish additional outposts in the area of Laguna de Lanao in the central part of Mindanao. The campaign began with the landings at Malati on May 28, 1891, and lasted until August the same year. On August 15, 1891, Weyler's troops finally landed in Linamon. From that day on, the San Quintin and the transport Manila were involved in various operations in the southern Philippines. Starting in 1893, both vessels, the Manila and the San Quintin, sustained frequent breakdowns of their engines, which became common problems. The engineers and their crews did their best to keep the machinery running, but increasing failures of the main steam piping and various pressure vessels were clear indications that the engine's operational lifespan was about to end soon.
In 1894, the San Quintin was laid up and decommissioned at Cavite, a move that ultimately ended her active life and eventful career. She had been literally a workhorse of the seven seas. Over a time span of 42 years, the brave steamer had served under 2 flags and fulfilled its duties in no less than 6 armed conflicts in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean and Caribbean Sea, and in the South and Western Pacific. It seems plausible and conservatively estimated that the San Quintin completed a total distance of more than 120,000 nautical miles, which is equivalent to 5 times circumnavigating the world. In the last months of 1896, negotiations about overhauling the engine of the transport Manila came to fruition, and the English manufacturer sent a new main engine and auxiliary machinery to the Philippines. The shipment eventually arrived in Cavite in January 1897. However, the works appeared to be more difficult than expected, and it took more than 2 months before the new propulsion plant could undergo sea trials. The costly renewal of the engine of the Manila and the issues encountered during the installation works confirmed the decision of the Navy Commission to abstain from purchasing also a new engine for the San Quintin, especially in view of the fact that she was 15 years older than the Manila. While the San Quintin was laid up and rotting at the arsenal of Cavite, the steamer Manila had been assigned to continue with replenishments to the various strongpoints in the Philippines and transporting troops to crush the increasing insurrection which emerged in all parts of the country. In December 1897, while she performed her task of coaling dispersed Spanish garrisons and naval stations on the northern coast of Luzon, the ship was caught by a furious storm and sustained major technical breakdowns. Fortunately, the crew managed to bring her back to the arsenal at Cavite, where the vessel was then repaired. Here they met again, the San Quintin, their longtime sister-in-arms, which was in poor condition since she had already been dismasted and widely stripped off.
In addition to the insurrection, the Spanish rule over the Philippines was menaced by dark clouds looming up on the horizon. On February 15, 1898, the armored cruiser U.S. Maine exploded in the port of Havana in Cuba, an incident which caused extreme political tensions between Spain and the United States. It soon became obvious that an armed conflict with the new emerging American naval power will inevitably have significant repercussions on the remaining Spanish colonies in the West Pacific. In April 1898, in preparation for war with the United States, the steamer Manila was pushed with greatest urgency to conduct transport missions between Cavite and Olongapo. On April 13th, she loaded torpedo cables for Subic Bay. These were actually electric igniter cables for the tethered mines intended to block the entrance to the bay. On April 20th, the vessel received orders for towing the cannibalized hulk of the San Quintin to Olongapo. Then, on April 22nd, the Manila loaded 500 tons of coal for Subic Bay to ensure there were sufficient stocks at the arsenal of Olongapo in case American naval forces would impose a blockade of the harbor. The facilities already built in and around Subic Bay, and those that were in the process of construction, had little or no role to play with the war with the United States. At the beginning of the year 1898, various steps had been taken to prevent the bay from falling into enemy hands. Activities were increased after news had reached the Philippines about the sinking of the USS Maine at Havana in Cuba. Rear Admiral Patricio Montojo, commanding admiral of the Spanish naval forces in the Philippines, believed Subic Bay was the right place to protect his squadron, since it had, in his view, better conditions than the much larger Manila Bay.
With 6 ships in a column, on April 25th, Montojo weighed anchor at Cavite and set out for Subic Bay. He hoped to take advantage of minefields and shore batteries installed at the entrance to the bay in the likely event of an attack by U.S. Navy forces. During the voyage, the old cruiser Castilla began to take on water through her tail shaft bearing. Moreover, her engine and boilers had been in such poor shape that she was capable only of low speed, and the only method of stopping the water ingress, plugging the leak with cement, blocked her propeller shaft, leaving her to rely on sails or towing. Upon arrival on the next morning, Admiral Montojo met with Captain Del Rio, who was in charge of the naval base at Olongapo. Del Rio tried to convince the admiral that all major defence works would be completed shortly. He reported that one of the first steps he ordered was to block the east entrance channel to the bay, between Grande Island and the southern shore. For this purpose, 3 obsolete ships had been scuttled there. 2 old and decommissioned merchant sailing ships, so-called brigantines, were aligned and sunk in the middle of the channel. On top of that, the hulk of the former armed transport San Quintin had been towed from Olongapo and scuttled close to Chiquita Islet, just south of Grande Island. A visual inspection of the fortifications on Grande Island carried out by the admiral and his staff revealed that the situation was, in Montojo's view, unsustainable. Remarkably, Captain Del Rio did not subscribe to the admiral's opinion and politely expressed his ideas how to effectively defend Subic Bay against an enemy approaching from the sea. However, the admiral had already made his firm decision to move back to Manila Bay to await combat there under the least bad conditions and with opportunities to disperse the ships to shallow water in order to beach them if necessary and save lives as a last resort, as he wrote later in his report. Well, the rest of the story is known. Admiral Montojo's ships returned to Cavite, where they were attacked by Commodore Dewey's Asiatic Squadron on May 1st, 1898, and completely annihilated.
So, is this the end of the story? Surprisingly not. Because even after more than 125 years, some wreckage of the amazing steamship San Quintin still exists and can be explored even by less experienced recreational divers. The place where the San Quintin came to rest is a sandy slope on the bottom of Subic Bay's eastern entrance, pretty close to the uninhabited Chiquita Islet. Until 1992, the year when the U.S. Navy handed over their naval base to the Philippines, no any expert line drawing of the wreck existed at all. After the former military facilities had come under the administration of the Subic Bay Metropolitan Authority, SBMA, most of the bay's water areas were open to tourism and scuba diving activities. Ever since, the remains of the San Quintin are among the most attractive dive sites in the Philippines and visited by hundreds of scuba divers every year. American, Australian, and German wreck diving experts Brian Labutte, Brian Homan, and Captain Peter Heimstadt were among the first civilian divers who plunged down to the San Quintin in 1992 and prepared some mapping of the wreck site, and their drawings became helpful tools for proper dive planning. By the year 2007, the bow and stern sections of the wreck were still largely intact. Meanwhile, continued erosion has taken its toll, and the iron hull has suffered dearly from ongoing decay. In view of the fact that the riveted hull structure dates back to the year 1852, also naval architects among wreck divers expressed their amazement over the amount of remaining iron debris. It is a clear indication that 19th century Scottish shipbuilding followed ironclad rules even when designing commercial vessels. The wreck lies on its port side, and parts of its midship section have been sinking into the seabed. In this regard, it may be of certain interest that a series of Philippine dive site charts has been created by German master mariner and wreck diver Peter Heimstadt. Encouraged by the success of his best-selling dive site booklet about Japanese wrecks in Cunard Bay, Palawan, he recently published another one about the better-known shipwrecks on the bottom of Subic Bay. The booklets are the result of a lengthy and privately funded research work, and most wanted by enthusiastic wreck divers who, at the same time, want some memorabilia of their adventurous diving activities. Copies of his booklets are only available in the Philippines through selected scuba dive centers against payment of a token charge. Interested persons may message Historicus Navalis via the comments function hereunder.
This most recent footage shows the actual condition of the wreck. Along with the constant erosion of the wreckage, unfortunately, also the underwater visibility in the bay has been reduced over the years. This is certainly owed to the increasing population between Olongapo and the town of Subic, and the amount of sewage passed into the bay without any wastewater treatment. Here, the rudder and tiller are visible. Web frames and some few stringers can be seen disintegrated, spread out and flattened on the seabed. The most interesting objects are certainly the two large steam boilers. As it was said, it is not clear whether they are the original fire tube boilers from 1852 or replaced ones from 1880. Engineers familiar with boiler technology may easily recognize that they are horizontal return tubular fire tube boilers, a boiler type favored on early steamships due to its low installation height.
Another quite conspicuous feature to be noted is the remaining gun emplacement on the starboard side amidships. Also known as sponsons, there were actually two gun platforms, one on each side of the upper deck, projecting outboard. As already explained before, the San Quintin had been rearmed when dry docked in the arsenal of Cartagena in 1882. The two obsolete Ordóñez cannons had been replaced by the modern Honteria type 79 or Type 83 breech-loading guns, both of which had a caliber of 4.7 inch. Much to our regret, the bow section, which was pretty much intact until 2007, ever since suffered dearly from heavy erosion. Today, the only residual parts are the sharp stem post and some debris of the iron plates above the bottom strakes. In riveted iron hull vessels, the overlapping plates were joggled by heated rivets, therefore forming so-called strakes, which compose the ship's shell plating and ran along the hull from stem to stern. It is astonishing to see the iron rivets surviving more than 170 years of exposure to polar and tropical saltwater. Similar vessels of much younger age that came to rest in relatively shallow waters were rotting away in half of that time span. Even the wreck of the Titanic shows a magnitude of erosion, although she lies in very deep and cold water, low in oxygen.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this informative excursion into naval and maritime history. Please subscribe and kindly let us know your comments. Stay tuned for another documentary about ships and seafarers, maritime myths and mysteries, and untold stories from the past. Wishing you always fair winds and sufficient underkeel clearance.
Tú eres cariño, yo no lo puedo.